Nearly 80 years after the Holocaust, it's clear that the United States could have done much more to save Jewish lives. Americans were deeply divided over how, or even if, to respond to Nazi persecution. It wasn't only that many Americans did not want to sacrifice their sons as soldiers and enter another war. Many were indifferent to the plight of Jewish refugees, or even openly suspicious of Jews. What may surprise some people today is that there were also groups of Americans who publicly embraced Nazi ideology. In communities like Andover Township in New Jersey, where this footage was filmed in the late 1930s, they gathered, waving the stars and stripes and swastika flags side by side. Today we'll talk about the varied ways that Americans reacted to news from Nazi Germany, those who urged U.S. government action, and those who wanted no part of a conflict that seemed a world away. Thank you for joining us. I'm your host, historian Edna Friedberg. Some of you may have heard about or watched parts of a film that premiered on PBS earlier this week, The U.S. and the Holocaust, which examines America's divided response to Nazi persecution. It was partly inspired by our museum's exhibition, Americans in the Holocaust. And today we're so pleased to welcome my friend and colleague, Ron Coleman, the chief of the library for the museum's Rubenstein Institute. Hi there, Ron. Good morning.
Good morning, Edna, and good morning, everyone.
Ron was part of the team that worked to create our exhibition, which opened in 2018. And we hope if you have questions for him, you'll post them in the comments section so we can get to as many of them as possible during the live program. So as we continue to grapple with and try to understand the complex events from the Holocaust era, we often hear people say, well, no one in the US really knew what was happening. And while it's true that the scale of the Nazi killing machine wasn't fully appreciated until war's end, any American reading the newspaper knew years earlier, years before liberation, that Jews in Germany were in serious danger, even before mass murder began. Ron, can you tell us about one night of mass violence that made headlines across the United States and, at least briefly, outraged many Americans?
Yes. So the Nazis seized power in Germany in 1933, as we know, and they spent the next several years laying the groundwork for violence against Jews in Germany. They passed discriminatory laws. They stripped Jews of their citizenship, all leading up to November 9th, 1938. On that night, the Nazis unleashed a coordinated wave of violence and destruction across Germany in newly annexed Austria and Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia. Thousands of Jewish men were arrested. Jewish-owned businesses were vandalized, and synagogues were burned, all while police and firefighters were ordered to stand by and do nothing. This night we now call Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, and it marked a shift in Nazi Germany from legal restrictions and legal persecution and harassment to indiscriminate violence and terror against the Jews in Germany. All of this was actively endorsed by the German government, by the Nazis. In small towns and in big cities all across America, the events of that night and the following days made news, often on the front page, as you see here. And it remained headline news in the United States for weeks afterwards, at a time that we should remember this is when newspapers were the main way that Americans got their news. We know that this news coverage did make an impact on Americans too. We have polls that were taken at the time that showed that 94% of Americans who were polled were at least sympathetic to the victims of Kristallnacht.
So sympathetic, worried about what they saw, but Americans had the luxury of distance. Even American Jews had the luxury of distance. In Germany and in recently annexed Austria and parts of Czechoslovakia, the threat was all too real. After Kristallnacht, tens of thousands of Jews were desperate to flee. And long lines, like this one that we're seeing outside of the Polish embassy in Vienna, the capital of Austria, they saw lines like this across German territory as Jews tried, with desperation to get documents that would enable them to escape Nazi rule. I'd like to bring this down, though, to a personal level, help us to understand what this meant in households, in families. Ron, please introduce us to Joseph and Susan Hilsonrath, who at the time, as we can see in this very cute picture, were brother and sister, only 8 and 9 years old, living in the German town of Bad Kreuznach. What happened to their family on the night of broken glass that you just described, November 1938?
Well, Susan and her younger brother, Joe, were awakened that night, November, by the sounds of shattering glass. A brick was thrown through their bedroom window late that night. Susan hid in fear, and Joe, who was only 8 at this time, hoisted himself up to the ledge of their window to see what was happening below. Susan later remembered Joe turning to her and saying, "Susie, it is our neighbors doing this." The children were stunned to discover that the people that they knew, their neighbors, their friends' parents, were the ones who were attacking their home. They raced into their parents' bedroom, and they found that a rock had landed in their baby brother Ernst's crib, narrowly missing him. Before that night was over, the Hilsonrath's neighbors had ripped down a lamppost and had rammed it through the family's front door, covering the floor with shards of colored glass. Their father, Israel, was arrested along with thousands of other men and boys for no crime other than for being Jewish. Many of these men were sent to concentration camps across Germany. With her mother and brothers, Susan hid in an attic for several days. Before Kristallnacht, the family, Israel and Annie Hilsonrath, the Susan and Joe's parents, had actually debated about whether to leave Germany. This was their home, but they hadn't been able to agree on whether they should leave. After that night, they were certain that they had to get their family out.
And we can hear directly from Susan and Joseph remembering back in a clip from the PBS film, The U.S. and the Holocaust.
My father had a cousin who lived in the Bronx, and they had a pickle factory. And they figured that maybe they would help them come to the United States. But it was almost impossible because the United States had a quota, and I guess our family didn't fit into this quota. So my father had to think of some kind of way to get his children into a safe place.
Our parents told us that we had to get out and leave, and that they would follow us, and that we would go to France, where people would take children out of the country for money.
My father had heard of this lady, a French lady, who smuggled children across the border into France. And I understand that he gave her all of the money to take my brother and me across the border. I was almost 10 years old by then, and my brother was 8. And I remember it vaguely because the horror of being separated from my parents, I have pushed it way in the back of my mind. I can't remember how we got to the train station and how we said goodbye to them. But all I know now is, I'm a mother and I'm a grandmother, and the idea of sending my children away is unbelievably horrible. I can't even imagine doing that.
That type of wrenching decision that Susan is reflecting on from her own parents is clearly resonating with people watching our show, Ron. We have a viewer named Jennifer who writes in to say, as a mother, I would hate to send my child away, but if it was my child's life or possible death, I'd have sent my child to the moon if need be to save him. I can see why her parents spent their savings sending their 2 oldest away, praying every day for them to be safe. Thank you, Jennifer. I know many other people watching feel the same way. I'd also like to pause for a second to welcome our viewers who are watching from all over the country. Good morning to you in Jamestown, New York, Dartmouth, Massachusetts, Raleigh, North Carolina, and Avila, Indiana. And welcome to our international viewers who are watching from Italy, Portugal, and Vietnam. We're so glad you are here. So Ron, this very, very painful decision that Susan described of her parents sending them away, not knowing if and when they would ever see them again, was forced on Jewish parents like the Hilsonraths because there were so few places that were open to immigrate as a family. This difficulty, in particular with the United States, that she mentioned in acquiring visas to here was not unusual, was it, Ron? What was she talking about with quotas?
Well, it was all too common for German Jews who were trying to flee. And it's worth stepping back and talking a little bit about what this system, this immigration system that the Hilsonrath family was trying to face in getting to the United States. The United States at this time, of course, it's important to remember, was experiencing a Great Depression, but that's not all to what was happening in this story. There was also a strong isolationist strain in the United States that went back decades. In 1924, isolationist and anti-Semitic strain that went back decades. In the 1920s, racist and anti-Jewish sentiments in America fueled the passage of a series of strict immigration laws. The previously open immigration, relatively open immigration, suddenly was closed in the 1920s. There were now strict quotas of the maximum number of people born in a certain country who could enter the United States each year. Jews were not singled out specifically in these laws. The laws were by country of birth, not by nationality or religion or race. But the laws were specifically designed to privilege and give opportunities for refugees who, immigrants who, at the time, the people who wrote the law felt were desirable. Protestant, white refugees or immigrants. It suppressed the number of quotas, the number of slots available for those from countries with large Jewish or Catholic populations in Eastern and Southern Europe. And it's important to remember that these laws did not differentiate between immigrants who were seeking a better way of life and refugees, people who were fleeing violence or persecution, like the Jewish refugees from Germany, like the Hilsonraths, who were clearly had been facing violence, especially after Kristallnacht. And despite those sympathies that we talked about earlier, if you remember, more than 90% of the country expressed sympathy for what was happening to the Jews in Germany after Kristallnacht, most Americans still did not support liberalizing these immigration laws to allow Jewish refugees to enter the United States.
So for most people in this country, sympathy was where it ended. They felt bad about it, but didn't think they had to do anything about it. However, even with all the legal barriers that you just outlined for us, there were some audacious few who made efforts to help Jewish refugees. Tell us about a piece of legislation that was meant to provide some measure of compassion to children in danger.
Sure. Well, the few members of Congress still hoped that Americans would be willing to pry open the window of opportunity for immigration and for people fleeing persecution just a little bit, especially for children. In February 1939, New York Senator Robert Wagner, a Democrat, and Republican Edith Norris Rogers of Massachusetts introduced identical bills in the House and the Senate that would have allowed 20,000 German children under the age of 14, 10,000 children a year over 2 years, to enter the country outside of the quota system. So they would not count against those strict immigration quotas that Susan was talking about and we were just talking about. This is precisely the kind of policy that would have helped families like the Hilsonraths, who were looking to place their children like Susan and Joe. The sponsors, though, were very careful about how they promoted the bills. If you were listening, I said the sponsors wanted to help German children. They specifically did not target to say that this was to help Jewish children. And they did this because they recognized that there was a strong strain of anti-Semitism and nativism in this country at the time, and that Americans would likely be put off by a measure specifically designed to help the Jews. So remember that because this was so, anti-Semitism was so widespread, those who supported this bill were very careful not to say these were to help Jewish children. And they made assurances that would help all children, Christian and Jewish.
So they framed it in a way that would be more palatable to a range of people. And how did the American public respond to this proposal? Did that framing work?
Well, Americans were divided. There were many organizations like the American Legion and the Daughters of the American Revolution who were openly opposed to the bill. They claimed that refugee children would eventually worsen unemployment rates in the United States. Others opposed the bill because they said that it would tear families apart. But let's be clear here. Despite what this bill's sponsors said, most people recognized that Jewish children were the intended beneficiaries. And that was a problem. People heard comments like 10,000 charming children would all too soon become 10,000 ugly adults. There was this barely masked undercurrent of anti-Jewish hatred among many of the opponents of these bills. But it did have its sponsors, though. The American Federation of Labor was one. They argued that the bill would not take jobs away from Americans. There was a refugee aid organization formed that promised to solicit private donations to cover the costs for caring for these children so that the government funding would not be required.
All these attempts to kind of mask anti-Jewish sentiment or disgust or distrust of foreigners, some of it just feels absurd when you talk about the argument that, oh, it would tear German families apart. We know these families were already being torn apart, as you just described to us, in a different and tragic way. But this bill did not only divide lobbyists and organizations. Ron, can you share a debate that was taking place more quietly within the walls of the White House here in Washington?
Yes, well, the Wagner-Rogers bill actually exposed a split between the president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and his wife, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. This really was the first bill of any kind that Eleanor openly endorsed during her husband's presidency. We know that the First Lady wanted her husband, FDR, to publicly support the bill, too. And we know this because there was a time when the president was on travel away from the White House. And as a result, they were communicating by telegram. And historians have found a pair of telegrams between the two specifically referencing the Wagner-Rogers bill. This speaks to the urgency that Eleanor felt about the issue. Eleanor wrote to say that she hoped that FDR would publicly signal his support. Franklin telegraphed back that Eleanor was welcome to indicate her support, but it would be best for the president to say nothing.
So interesting. I know I'm a historian, I'm a history nerd too, but looking at these two, flat pieces of paper, they show a debate, a dispute between a powerful husband, powerful wife, and also the urgency that she felt to communicate with her husband about it, because telegram would have been one of the quickest ways she could get in touch with him. But help us understand, why was FDR reluctant to follow his wife's lead?
Well, looking back, this is one of the many points in the history of the Holocaust and the history of this era where demonstrates that rescuing Jews was never a priority for FDR's administration. FDR always had other aspects of his agenda that were more immediate priorities. In this case, in 1939, it's important to remember the context of what's happening around these comments. The president needed the support of Southern Democrats. These were powerful members of Congress who were in his political party. Many of them were among the loudest opponents of expanding immigration and were openly anti-Semitic in some cases. Their votes were crucial, though, to advancing other policies that FDR deemed more pressing. And we look back, and I think we often wish and we want the president to have been a humanitarian first in a situation like this. But at this moment, his main goal and what he felt his main responsibility was twofold. One, to continue recovery from the Great Depression, and two, to get Congress's support in a deeply isolationist country that wanted nothing to do with any foreign wars. He wanted to shift this country onto a footing where they could at least provide military aid to countries like England that could potentially be attacked by Germany. Because at this point, 1939, it was becoming evident that Germany was moving towards war. And FDR needed Congress to repeal legislation that would have prohibited the United States from selling military equipment to countries like Great Britain and France. Without public support and without FDR's backing, the Wagner-Rogers bill failed. It never even came up for a vote.
And Ron, we've been receiving a number of comments on Facebook about FDR. Among them, a man named Rick has written in to say Roosevelt could have saved thousands of those people. He deliberately chose not to. I think one of the things that surprised me as I learned more about this period of American history was that the US had no refugee policy at the time, only this immigration policy that you've described to us with all of its restrictions and limitations. And so there was not a separate track for people in danger. We can't know what FDR was thinking. He didn't keep diaries. There was not a lot of sources that gives us insight into what was in his head or in his heart. We only know what he did, and certainly more could have been done. Ron, you've described for us lots of competing political realities that were at times overriding compassion, but viewers may be surprised to learn that at this time, at these same years in the late 1930s, some Americans actually enthusiastically and unapologetically embraced Nazi beliefs. Tell us about a group called the German-American Bund and its efforts to spread Nazi ideology here in the United States.
Yes, well, the Bund, the German-American Bund, was a pro-German organization that had been around for many years. As the 1930s wore on, it became more and more pro-Nazi. The members of the Bund were primarily German immigrants to this country and Americans of German descent. Like the Nazis in Germany, the Bund demonized Jews and demonized communism, and they portrayed them as threatening to a way of life that they wanted to support. The Bund was open in their reverence of Adolf Hitler, while also claiming somehow to be a patriotic organization for patriotic American citizens. The Bund wanted the U.S. to avoid getting involved in European conflicts because they recognized that American neutrality might actually benefit Nazi Germany.
And the Bund here in the U.S. Tried to gain members and make it appealing by opening kind of retreat centers, like a summer camp kind of place, similar to such camps that were for the Hitler Youth in Germany. They were opening these locations near cities and towns in the U.S. with large German immigrant or German descent populations, hoping that it would resonate. And like the footage that we saw at the beginning of today's program, while gathering there, members of the group would dress in Nazi uniforms and they would carry both American and Nazi flags. Tell us about, Ron, about how a small town in Connecticut prevented the German-American Bund from gaining a foothold in their backyard.
Yeah, this is a really meaningful story, I think, to a lot of viewers. 1 year before Kristallnacht, so just to place us in time, this is before the violence against Jews broke out in November 1938. The German-American Bund turned to a small town called Southbury, Connecticut, with the high hopes of building another compound like the one you described to spread Nazi ideology. Southbury was a quiet farm town that had a little more than 1,000 residents. Most people who lived there did not have a lot of money. Electricity was actually rare at this time. The town's children attended a one-room schoolhouse. In September 1937, again, a year before Kristallnacht, a member of the German-American Bund bought 178 acres in just around outside of Southbury. He and other Bund members wanted to create the largest Bund camp in the country, big enough to host 10,000 people at a time. But once the people of Southbury got wind of the Bund's plans, they began to act. There was a local minister, Reverend Emmy and Lindsay. He delivered a moving sermon to his congregation, denouncing the Bund for being anti-Christian and anti-American. Local residents staged public protests, as you see here. In a packed meeting of 200 Southbury residents, the Southbury Town Council voted to pass their first ever zoning laws. These laws permitted only residential and farming use in the area, which effectively prevented a camp like what the Bund was hoping to do from being built. And the Bund was defeated. They slunk out of Southbury as quietly as they could after this law was passed.
And we're so pleased this morning to have viewers with us today watching from the town of Southbury, Connecticut, including students from Pomparog High School and the Southbury Historical Society. You can feel justifiably proud of what your townspeople did years ago inspiring us to show what a community can do when they say, no, we will not tolerate, you are not welcome here. However, despite Southbury's success, the Bund was actually welcomed in other towns. They also spread Nazi propaganda in the US through magazines and demonstrations. And we have film footage from 1939 taken from the documentary called The Night at the Garden, which shows how the German-American Bund packed New York's Madison Square Garden with enthusiastic supporters in one of its largest public events.
We, with American ideals, demand that our government shall be returned to the American people who founded it.
If you ask what we are actively fighting for under our charter, first, a social, just, white, Gentile, ruled United States.
This footage, it's really disturbing, but it's also confusing. I mean, with the choreography and the flags, and almost you could believe you were seeing a Nazi party rally in Germany. But then there's this enormous image of President George Washington and all these Americans staged with swastikas. Ron, what in the world was happening at Madison Square Garden that night?
Well, this rally that we just saw took place in February 1939. So this is just a few months after Kristallnacht was front page news across the country. And it's 2 days before the country would be celebrating the birth of its first president, George Washington. The Bund actually billed this as a pro-America rally. That clip that we just saw ended with Fritz Kuhn, who was the head of the German-American Bund, spelling out the organization's goals and rallying, stirring up the crowd. About 20,000 people attended this rally. And it is important to note, I think, that the Bund really was a kind of a fringe group, especially at this time. It certainly was not the majority of the American people. But 20,000 people is a lot of people to attend a Nazi rally in the United States in 1939. And this crowd that attended this rally was enthralled by Kuhn in his speech. As you heard, he spoke about the rights of white Christians, who he called America's true patriots. He attacked the press. He criticized American Jewish leaders. Outside the garden, we should note, there were close to 100,000 people protesting this rally. As we've been saying, Americans were divided at this time. These protesters were contained by police on horseback, with the exception of one young Jewish man who managed to sneak in to witness the display. He became so outraged by what he heard in Kuhn's speech that he rushed towards the stage, shouted, "Down with Hitler." He was immediately surrounded and beaten up and hauled off the stage, and the crowd loved it.
And there may have been debate about whether they should gather, even if Nazi ideas were soundly rejected by most Americans, but whether they should be allowed to hold such a rally. Groups like the American Jewish Committee, which is a communal organization, recognized that the Bund still had a right to assemble and espouse their views in a free country. One of my favorite quotes with regard to this event came from New York Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia, who ridiculed the rally as an exhibition of international cooties, which should be exposed to the sunlight. So making it clear that only with distaste were they allowed to gather in his city. But tell us a little more about the man whose speech we just heard. Who was Fritz Kuhn, the leader of this group?
Yes, Fritz Kuhn is a kind of fascinating and pretty disturbing figure. He was among the loudest voices in the United States opposing Jewish immigration in this period, and we can clearly hear his German accent. He came to the United States in 1926. He actually got one of those rare visas under the 1924 immigration law. He managed to make it in 1926. and he became a citizen of the country in 1934. He actually worked for Henry Ford, who's a notorious anti-Semite. Kuhn styled himself as the Bundesführer, the America's Führer. This was a title that was picked up by the press. But less than a year after that rally in Madison Square Garden, Kuhn was arrested and convicted for embezzling funds from the Bund, and he was imprisoned and eventually deported back to Germany.
So whatever his hateful beliefs, he also clearly had other motivations, including greed and delusions of grandeur. I'm sure everyone watching finds it kind of strange that his followers saw no contradiction in having Kuhn, himself an immigrant, lead the charge against what his followers were portraying as foreign invaders. So really just kind of a bizarre scene. But the Madison Square Garden event was really the height of the German-American Bund's influence in this country. It continued to operate in the United States until December 1941. And after the United States entered the war following Pearl Harbor, the government outlawed the organization for its support of what was now an official military enemy. Ron, as we close today's program, I'd like to return to the family you introduced us to at the beginning of the show, Susan and Joe, the young German children who were awakened in their bedroom by shattering glass and then separated from their parents. You know the story of the Hilsonraths quite well. Susan, now a grown woman, of course, is actually a survivor volunteer at our museum. And her brother Joe learned more about their immigration story through records that you discovered as an archivist at the museum. What did you find? And tell us what became of their family. Were they separated long from their parents?
Well, this story shows how we're still learning about the experiences of individuals and families. Even if they think they know everything, we're still learning based on the material that we collect here at the museum. So a few years ago, I was going through a large collection of documents from a refugee aid organization, and I found a case file about a particular family called the Hilsonraths that had hundreds of letters and memos and other documents, and it really showed the sort of heart-wrenching efforts that the parents, Israel, was writing to these organizations, was writing to the State Department, was writing elsewhere to desperately try to reunite his family. And it turned out that this was about someone I knew, Susan Worsinger, a volunteer at the museum. And these documents really flesh out the story of what happened after what we heard, the decision to send the children to Paris. So when we last saw Susan and Joe, they were on their way to Paris, but they would not be safe there for long. The Germans entered Paris in June of 1940. Susan and her younger brother were forced to flee south into unoccupied area of France, along with thousands of others. They eventually found their way into the care of a French organization for refugee children. Now, their parents had made it, and younger brother had made it to America separately. Their number had come up in the quota line, and they managed to successfully immigrate to the US. And this case file that I found really helps us to fill in what happened next. So from his new home in Washington, D.C., Susan and Joe's father, Israel, wrote to multiple aid organizations begging for help in reuniting his family. He found help in HIAS, then known as the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, and through the American Friends Service Committee, a Quaker organization. That's the organization whose files I was going through when I found this. Those organizations were able to secure transport for the children to leave France. And once the children were granted visas, they traveled to Lisbon, Portugal, where they boarded a ship called the Serpa Pinto, along with about 50 other children that the organizations were helping to come to the US. And they arrived in September 1941. And here you can see the group of children, and in particular, Susan and Joe, highlighted in this newspaper clipping from when they arrived.
And we can hear directly from Susan and Joe as adults looking back years later, recalling their arrival into the United States.
Finally, it was time to get to the United States. And they told all the children that the next morning at 6 o'clock, we were going to pass the Statue of Liberty. Of course, we had learned what the Statue of Liberty was all about. So they told us to be on deck to see it. At exactly 6 o'clock, that fog went up like this, like the curtain at an opera or at a concert or at a plane went up like that. And right there, just as it was going up, was the Statue of Liberty.
The fog lifted. And there it was. After all this, it's even worse now. After all these years, to taste freedom, do you? It was just remarkable. And the effects apparently has never left me. I realized that I didn't have to worry about getting killed, which was part of your being, and that you're gonna be able to live and grow old and have a life.
That clip, Edna, is so meaningful for me, and I'm sure it is for many of our viewers. And Susan and Joe's story is so meaningful for me because, to me, it shows that for all of the divisions that we explored today, for all of the forces that were working against Jewish families like the Hilsonraths, there were forces and there were people who were advocating for them. It really underscores for me that we can still find reasons to be encouraged. It's such a dark history when we study, but there are points of light that we can find in that darkness. And we can be inspired by the actions of individuals and groups working for people like Susan and Joe.
Absolutely, Ron. I couldn't agree more. And actually, Susan Hilsonrath, now Susan Warsinger, her married name, is watching this morning, and she wrote in to say, I appreciate your sharing my family's experiences during Kristallnacht and while trying to immigrate to the United States. I hope that the audience gets a better understanding of what was happening in Germany and the US in 1938 and 1939. And Ron, I know that you helped to fill in some gaps that as kids in France, Susan and Joe could not have known. The letter writing campaign, the persistent, desperate efforts that their parents were working at to get them there, and that this dusty file that people like you find years later helps to fill in the gaps in that story. So thank you, Ron.
Well, I'm so glad to have been able to help them and many other people that we help to try to fill in gaps in their stories.
We also have a viewer named Kathy who wrote to say how moved she was by the story of Susan and Joe. Kathy writes that the struggles of these beautiful children and their families must never be forgotten, and the evils of the past will always try to rise up again unless we stand our ground against them. Ron, it was a real pleasure to have you as our guest. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Edna, and thank you everyone for watching.
And listening to Susan and Joseph reflect on their experience, remembering that moment of seeing the mist rise over the Statue of Liberty, a symbol of refuge recognized the world over, reminds us of the promise of America and also of the many failures that we cannot brush over or erase from our history, and arguments over the values for which we still stand and to which we can aspire. So thank you so much for watching with us today. We hope you learned as we did from these stories, and we hope to see you next time as well. Bye-bye.